The auction block beneath Delilah Porter's feet felt like the edge of the world. Every plank of weathered wood a reminder that her life had been reduced to a transaction beneath the scorching Montana sun. Fort Benton in the summer of 1878 was a place where fortunes were made and lost on the Missouri River, where steamboats brought supplies and took away furs, where desperate men made desperate choices, and where her father's gambling debts had finally caught up with them in the cruelest way imaginable. The crowd of dusty miners, ranchers, and merchants gathered before her blurred into a sea of unfamiliar faces, their voices rising in bids that made her stomach turn with each increment, each number a chain that would bind her to whatever stranger had the most money and the least conscience. Delilah was 20 years old, with hair the color of autumn wheat and eyes that held more strength than her trembling hands suggested. She had watched her mother die of fever 3 years prior, had kept their small household running while her father, Michael Porter, drowned his grief in whiskey and card games. She had forgiven him time and again, believed his promises that he would change, that the next game would be different. Instead, he had wagered what he did not have, borrowed from men who did not forgive, and when they came to collect, he had offered the only thing of value he had left, his daughter. The auctioneer was a thick-necked man named Grimsby, who ran the trading post and apparently had no qualms about conducting business that skirted the edges of the law. Debt settlement, he called it, a private arrangement between consenting parties. Delilah had not consented to anything, but her father had signed papers that somehow made this nightmare legal enough that no one in Fort Benton seemed inclined to stop it. "Do I hear 300? Grimsby's voice boomed across the square. $300 for a healthy young woman, good with household work, can read and write. Come now, gentlemen, that is a bargain." Delilah wanted to scream that she was not livestock, not property to be sold, but her throat had closed with terror and humiliation. She searched the crowd for her father and found him at the back, unable to meet her eyes, his shoulders hunched with shame that came too late to matter. Part of her had died when he told her what he had done, when he explained through tears that it was this or they would both be killed. She had begged him to run, to take her away from Fort Benton, but he said there was nowhere they could go that these men would not find them. 300, called a voice, and Delilah's gaze snapped to a heavy-set man with cruel eyes and a reputation that made even the saloon girls wary. Her heart plummeted. 350. Another voice countered. The bidding continued, and Delilah felt consciousness starting to slip, the edges of her vision darkening. She locked her knees, determined not to faint, not to give these people the satisfaction of seeing her completely broken. Then a different voice cut through the chaos, calm and clear and carrying an authority that made others quiet. $1,000. The crowd turned as one, and Delilah followed their gaze to a tall man who had just dismounted from a paint horse at the edge of the gathering. He was perhaps 25, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of a winter storm. His clothing marked him as a working cowboy, denim pants dusty from the trail, a worn leather vest over a blue shirt, boots that had seen hard miles. But something in the way he carried himself suggested he was more than just a ranch hand. Grimsby's eyebrows shot up. 1,000. That is quite a sum, stranger. I have it. The cowboy's hand rested casually on his gun belt, not threatening, just present. And I would like to conclude this business quickly. Well now, let us see your money first, Grimsby said, greed lighting his features. The cowboy approached and the crowd parted for him. Up close, Delilah could see the hard planes of his face, the shadow of stubble on his jaw, the way his eyes flicked to her with something that might have been sympathy before focusing on the auctioneer. He pulled a leather pouch from inside his vest and counted out bills and coins with practiced efficiency. The amount was staggering, more money than Delilah had ever seen in one place. Grimsby counted it twice, his fingers shaking slightly. "This is indeed $1,000. Sold then to Mr. Yates, Xavier Yates. Sold to Mr. Xavier Yates." Grimsby made a notation in his ledger, then held out a piece of paper. "You will need to sign here, acknowledging receipt of goods and settling the debt of Michael Porter in full." Xavier took the pen, signed with a quick scrawl, then looked up at Delilah. "Come down from there, miss." Her legs were shaking so badly she was not sure they would hold her, but she managed the steps, nearly stumbling on the last one. Xavier caught her elbow, steadying her, his grip firm but not painful. Up close, she could smell leather and sage and horse, sense of the open range that seemed impossibly clean compared to the stench of fear that clung to her. "Can you ride?" he asked quietly. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Then let us go." He kept his hand on her elbow, guiding her toward his horse, and the crowd began to disperse now that the entertainment was over. Delilah caught sight of her father again, saw him take a step forward as if to speak, but Xavier positioned himself between them. "I think you have done enough, Porter," Xavier said, his voice low and hard. "If you have any decency left, you will stay away from her." "I never meant—" her father began, but Xavier was already lifting Delilah onto the paint horse, then swinging up behind her. His arms came around her to take the reins, and she felt the solid warmth of him at her back as he turned the horse toward the edge of town. They rode in silence through Fort Benton's dusty streets, past the grand hotels built by steamboat wealth, past the saloons and brothels and trading posts, past the crude shacks where men who had not struck it rich made their homes. Delilah's mind was reeling, unable to process what had just happened, what was happening now. This stranger had bought her. She was his property now, at least according to whatever twisted law allowed such things. She knew what men expected from women they purchased, had heard the stories from the dance hall girls who sometimes came to her for simple doctoring. Terror crawled up her spine as Xavier guided the horse out of town entirely, taking a trail that headed west into rolling grasslands. They rode for perhaps an hour, and Delilah's fear grew with each mile that separated them from civilization. Finally, when the sun was beginning its descent and Fort Benton was just a smudge on the horizon behind them, Xavier brought the horse to a stop near a stand of cottonwood trees that marked a creek. He dismounted, then helped her down, his hands on her waist impersonal and brief. Delilah's legs nearly gave out when her feet touched ground, and she staggered to one of the trees, pressing her back against it as if it could somehow protect her. Xavier was watching her with those storm cloud eyes, his expression unreadable. Then he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the paper Grimsby had given him, the proof of purchase, the document that said he owned her. "Can you read?" he asked. "Yes," she managed, her voice hoarse. "Then read this." He held out the paper. With trembling hands, Delilah took it, scanning the legal language, the signatures, the terrible finality of it all. Then Xavier struck a match, and before she could react, he touched the flame to the corner of the document. "What are you doing?" she gasped. "Giving you freedom," he said simply, holding the burning paper by the corner until the flames had consumed most of it, then dropping it to the dirt and grinding it under his boot heel. "That paper was the only thing that said I had any claim on you. Now it is gone." Delilah stared at the ashes, then at him, unable to comprehend. "I do not understand." Xavier removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "I was in Fort Benton to buy supplies for my ranch. I heard talk about the auction, about what your father had done. I thought maybe I could." He paused, seeming to search for words. "I could not let those men buy you, not when I knew what they would do. So I bought you myself with the money I had saved for breeding stock and winter provisions. And now I am setting you free." "Free," she repeated, the word foreign on her tongue. "Just like that, just like that." He met her eyes steadily. "You are not property, Miss Porter. What happened to you was wrong, and I am sorry for it, but you are free now. I will take you wherever you want to go. I can bring you back to Fort Benton if you have people there, or to another town if you prefer. I have a sister in Virginia City who would take you in if you need a place to start over. You decide." Delilah's knees gave out entirely, and she slid down the tree trunk until she was sitting in the grass, her whole body shaking with the release of tension she had been carrying since her father first told her what was going to happen. Tears came then, hot and unstoppable, months of fear and grief and betrayal pouring out of her. Xavier looked uncomfortable but did not leave. Instead, he busied himself with the horse, giving her privacy while staying close enough that she was not alone. When her tears finally subsided into hiccuping breaths, she found a canteen beside her and a clean handkerchief. She drank gratefully, wiped her face, tried to pull herself together. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice raw. "I do not know how to thank you properly for what you did." Xavier was crouched by the creek, refilling another canteen. "No thanks needed. It was the right thing to do. You spent $1,000. The enormity of it was sinking in." "That is a fortune," he shrugged, but she could see the tightness around his eyes. "Money can be earned again." "I could not have lived with myself if I had walked away." Delilah pushed herself to her feet, her legs still unsteady. "You said you have a ranch, about 20 miles from here, up in the hill country. It is not much yet, just a few hundred acres and a cabin, some cattle. I have been building it for 3 years now since I mustered out of the cavalry. And you are going to use that money for supplies. I will manage." His tone suggested the subject was closed, but Delilah's mind was racing. "I could work," she said suddenly, "to pay you back. You said you need help with the ranch, and I am good with household work. I can cook and clean and mend. I helped my mother with everything before she died, and I have kept house for my father since. I could work off the debt." Xavier turned to look at her, his expression serious. "You do not owe me anything. That is not why I did this." "I know," she said, and she did believe him. Everything about this man suggested honor, a quality she had thought extinct in Fort Benton. "But I do not have anywhere else to go. My father—" She could not finish, could not articulate the betrayal, how the man who raised her had sold her like chattel. "I cannot go back to him, and I do not know your sister in Virginia City, but you need help and I need a place. We could help each other." He studied her for a long moment. "It would not be like before. You would be a free woman working for wages. You could leave whenever you wanted. I understand. The work would be hard. Ranch life is not easy, especially where I am. We are isolated and winters are brutal. I am not afraid of hard work." Xavier nodded slowly. "All right, we can try it. But I want you to know, Miss Porter, that my home is a safe place. You would have your own room, your own space. I would expect nothing from you beyond the work we agree to, and I would pay you fair wages. Is that clear?" "Yes." Relief flooded through her, so intense it made her dizzy. A safe place. Work she could do. A chance to rebuild her life on her own terms. "It is very clear, Mr. Yates." "Xavier," he corrected. "If we are going to be working together, no need for formalities. Then you must call me Delilah." He smiled for the first time, and it transformed his serious face, making him almost boyish. "Delilah. That is a pretty name." They camped by the creek that night, Xavier insisting she take his bedroll while he slept on a saddle blanket closer to the fire. Delilah barely slept, her mind too full of the day's events, but when she did drift off, her dreams were not the nightmares she had expected. Instead, She dreamed of wide open spaces and the sound of a man's voice, low and kind, telling her she was free. The next morning they set out early, Xavier setting a steady pace that ate up the miles. He was not much for talking, but the silence was comfortable rather than oppressive. He pointed out landmarks, taught her the names of the birds that wheeled overhead, shared jerky and hardtack from his supplies without making her feel like a burden. By the time the sun was high, Delilah was starting to feel almost human again. The land changed as they traveled west, the flat grasslands giving way to rolling hills covered in sage and wild grasses that rippled like water in the wind. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still holding snow despite the summer heat. Delilah had never been this far from Fort Benton, had never seen country so vast and empty and beautiful. "It is magnificent," she said, the first words she had spoken in hours. Xavier followed her gaze to the mountains. "It is that. When I first came to Montana after the war, I thought I would never get used to how big everything is. Texas has space too, but this is different. This feels like the edge of the world. You are from Texas, born and raised outside San Antonio. Joined the cavalry when I was 18, saw more of the country than I ever wanted during the war and after. When my time was up, I wanted a place that was as far from battlefields as I could get." He gestured at the landscape around them. "Found it here." Delilah wanted to ask more about the war and what he had seen, about why he had chosen a life of isolation, but she sensed walls around those topics, pain he was not ready to share. She understood that. She had her own walls now, her own wounds too fresh to examine. They reached Xavier's ranch in the late afternoon, and Delilah's first impression was of how small and vulnerable it looked against the immensity of the landscape. The cabin was solidly built from logs, with a stone chimney and real glass windows that spoke of care and investment. There was a barn that looked newer than the cabin, a corral with several horses and fields where cattle grazed. A vegetable garden struggled against the harsh sun near the cabin, and chickens scratched in a wire pen. "It is not much," Xavier said, a note of apology in his voice. "But it is sound, and it is mine. Ours, I suppose, for as long as you are here." "It is wonderful," Delilah said honestly. After the fear and degradation of the past weeks, this simple homestead looked like paradise. Xavier showed her around, his pride in what he had built evident despite his modest words. The cabin had 2 rooms, the main living area with a kitchen, table and fireplace, and a smaller bedroom. Xavier immediately started moving his belongings out of the bedroom. "You should not have to give up your room," Delilah protested. "I sleep in the barn most nights anyway during summer," he said. "Easier to keep an eye on the horses. In winter I will rig a curtain, give us both privacy. But for now this is yours." The room was simple, just a bed frame with a corn husk mattress, a small table and pegs on the wall for clothes. But it had a window that looked out over the hills, and when Delilah sat on the bed, she felt something inside her begin to unknot. Her own room, her own space, safety. That first week was a period of adjustment for both of them. Delilah threw herself into work with an intensity born of gratitude and determination. She scrubbed the cabin until it gleamed, organized Xavier's haphazard kitchen, mended clothes that had been neglected for too long. She cooked proper meals, hearty stews and fresh bread that made Xavier's eyes widen with appreciation. She tended the struggling garden, coaxing the vegetables back to health with careful watering and weeding. Xavier worked from dawn until dark, riding out to check on the cattle, mending fences, breaking a new horse. He was unfailingly polite to Delilah, always knocking before entering the cabin, always thanking her for the meals, always careful to give her space. But she caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she could not quite read, something between concern and curiosity. It was during the second week that they began to talk, really talk. Xavier came in from a long day of riding fence lines to find Delilah on the porch, shelling peas in the evening light. Without asking, he sat down on the steps and began helping, and somehow that simple domestic task opened something between them. "Tell me about your mother," he said. "You mentioned you helped her before she died." Delilah found herself describing Margaret Porter, who had been a teacher before marriage, who had taught Delilah to read from the Bible and Shakespeare, who had filled their small house with learning and love. She talked about how her mother's death had broken something in her father, how he had started drinking and gambling, how Delilah had tried to hold their family together through sheer force of will. "I kept thinking if I was good enough, worked hard enough, loved him enough, he would stop," she said, her hands stilling on the peas. But he did not stop. He just kept going deeper into debt until there was nothing left to lose but me. Xavier was quiet for a moment. "It was not your fault. You know that, right? What he did, that was his weakness, his failure, not yours. I know that here." She touched her head, but here. She touched her heart. "I keep wondering if there was something more I could have done. There was not." His voice was firm, certain. "I have seen men like your father in the cavalry, men who ran from their pain into bottles and cards and worse. Nothing anyone did could save them. They had to want to save themselves, and most never did. Did you?" she asked quietly. "Want to save yourself?" He looked startled, then gave a rueful laugh. "I suppose I did. The war left marks on all of us, things we saw and did that we cannot forget. After I mustered out, I drifted for a while, took jobs punching cattle, did some scouting. But I was running, same as those men I judged. It was not until I found this land, started building something with my own hands, that I felt like I was moving forward instead of just away. Do the memories still bother you sometimes?" He went back to shelling peas, his hands steady, but less here. "There is something about this place that makes the past feel farther away, like I can be someone new." Delilah understood that longing to shed the past like an old skin and emerge fresh and unburdened. "I would like that too, to be someone new." "Then be her," Xavier said simply. "No one here knows you except me, and I only know what you choose to tell me. You can be whoever you want." The idea was intoxicating, terrifying, liberating. Delilah turned it over in her mind as they finished the peas in companionable silence, as they shared a simple supper, as she cleaned up, and he disappeared to the barn for the night. That night, lying in her small room with the window open to the cool night air, she thought about who she wanted to be. Not the girl who had been betrayed and sold, not the daughter who had failed to save her father, someone stronger, someone free. As summer deepened into the golden days of August, Delilah and Xavier fell into a rhythm that felt almost natural. She rose with the sun to start breakfast, packed him lunch for his long days on the range, kept the house, and tended the garden. He brought home fresh meat when he could, helped with heavy tasks, taught her to ride properly when he discovered she had only the most basic skills. Those riding lessons became the highlight of Delilah's days. Xavier was a patient teacher, never mocking her mistakes, always encouraging. He taught her to read the land, to watch for signs of weather, to move with the horse rather than against it. And as she grew more confident, he started taking her with him on short trips around the ranch. It was on one of these rides that Delilah began to see Xavier differently. They had stopped to water the horses at a creek, and she watched as he knelt by the water, his hat pushed back, sunlight catching in his dark hair. He was humming something under his breath, completely unself-conscious, and there was a peace about him in that moment that made her chest tighten. He was beautiful, she realized with a start. Not in the polished way of the dandies who occasionally passed through Fort Benton, but in a raw, honest way that was all hard work and integrity. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and smiled. "Something on my face?" "No, I was just thinking how lucky I am," she said, the truth slipping out before she could censor it. "That it was you at that auction, that of all the people in Fort Benton that day, you were the one who intervened." His smile faded into something more serious. "I am the lucky one, Delilah. This place was just a house before you came. You have made it a home." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither seemed ready to explore. Then Xavier stood, brushing off his pants, and the moment passed. But something had shifted. A recognition that what was growing between them was more than just employer and employee, more than just friendship. Delilah found herself thinking about him at odd moments, wondering what he was doing out on the range, looking forward to the sound of his boots on the porch at day's end. She started taking more care with her appearance, pinning her hair in ways her mother had taught her, wearing the one good dress Xavier had bought her on a supply run to a nearby settlement. She told herself it was just about self-respect, about reclaiming her femininity after the trauma of the auction. But when Xavier noticed, when his eyes lingered on her with something that looked like admiration, her heart would race in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Xavier, for his part, seemed to be waging his own internal battle. He was scrupulously proper, never touching her beyond what was necessary, always maintaining a careful distance. But Delilah caught him watching her sometimes with an intensity that made her skin warm, saw the way his jaw would tighten when she smiled at him, noticed how he seemed to find more excuses to be near the cabin than he had before she arrived. The tension between them built slowly, sweetly, through August and into September. And then came the day that changed everything. Delilah was in the garden picking tomatoes when she heard riders approaching. This was unusual. Xavier's ranch was isolated and visitors were rare. She straightened, shading her eyes, and felt her heart drop into her stomach as she recognized the lead horse, her father. Michael Porter looked worse than when she had last seen him, his face haggard and thin, his clothes hanging on a frame that had lost too much weight. He was accompanied by two other men, hard-looking characters that made Delilah's skin crawl. They rode right up to the cabin, and her father dismounted with the unsteady movements of someone who spent more time drinking than eating. "Delilah," he said, and his voice cracked on her name. "Delilah, I need to talk to you." She set down her basket, her mind racing. Xavier was out checking the north pasture, would not be back for hours. She was alone with these men, and old fears threatened to choke her. "There is nothing to say," she managed, keeping the garden fence between them. "You made your choice. I know I did wrong." He was crying now, easy tears that might have moved her once but now just made her angry. "But I am in trouble, real trouble. The men I owed, they are not satisfied. They want more and I do not have it, but you could help me. You are working here, you must have wages saved, just a little bit, enough to buy me some time." "No," the word came out hard and final. "I do not have anything for you." One of the other men, a scarred brute with dead eyes, spoke up. "Now, that is not very nice, is it? Your pa is in trouble and you are going to let him suffer." "He let me suffer," Delilah shot back. "He sold me to save his own skin. I owe him nothing." "Actually," the second man said, and his smile made her stomach turn, "you might still owe us. See, we did some checking. That paper that Cowboy signed, it was never filed proper with the county, which means legally your pa's debt is still outstanding, which means you still belong to us." Terror, sharp and metallic, flooded Delilah's mouth. "That is not true. The paper was valid." "Paper does not mean much when it has been burned, does it?" The scarred man started to dismount. "And lucky for us, we heard about that little bonfire. so we have come to collect what is rightfully ours." Delilah ran. She dropped the basket and bolted for the cabin, her only thought to reach the rifle she knew Xavier kept by the door. But her skirts tangled in her legs, and the men were faster. The scarred one caught her before she made it to the porch, his hand closing around her arm with bruising force. "Let go of me," she screamed, fighting with every ounce of strength she had. "Should have come quietly," he growled and raised his hand to strike her. The blow never landed. There was a sound like thunder, and the man's hat went flying, a bullet hole clean through the crown. He released Delilah and spun around, going for his gun, but froze at what he saw. Xavier sat on his horse at the edge of the yard, his rifle still raised, his face a mask of cold fury. "The next one goes through your skull, not over it," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Step away from her." The scarred man raised his hand slowly, stepping back. His companion had his hand on his gun but had not drawn, clearly calculating odds he did not like. "This is not your business, Yates," Michael Porter said, trying for authority and achieving only a pathetic whine. "She is my daughter." "She is a free woman who told you to leave," Xavier said, never lowering the rifle. "And you are trespassing on my land. So you have about 10 seconds to get back on those horses and ride out of here before I start putting holes in all of you." "The debt," the second man started, "is paid. I have a receipt from Grimsby, signed and dated, stating that Michael Porter's debts were settled in full. You want to argue different, take it up with him and the county sheriff, but you are not taking her." Xavier's finger moved to the trigger. 5 seconds. The men looked at each other, looked at Xavier's unwavering rifle, and evidently decided discretion was the wiser choice. They mounted up, the scarred one shooting Delilah a look that promised this was not over. Michael Porter hesitated, looking at his daughter with something that might have been regret. "I am sorry," he said. "I am so sorry, Delilah. Leave," she whispered. "Leave and do not ever come back." He flinched as if she had struck him, then hauled himself onto his horse and followed the other men. Xavier kept the rifle trained on them until they were out of sight, then finally lowered it and dismounted in one smooth motion. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tight. Delilah looked down at her arm where the scarred man had grabbed her, saw bruises already forming in the shape of fingers. "No, not really. You came back. I saw their tracks, realized we had visitors, and came at a gallop." He closed the distance between them, his hands hovering near her shoulders but not quite touching, as if he was afraid she would break. "I should have been here. I should have protected you better." "You saved me," she said. "Again." And then, because the fear and adrenaline and relief were too much to contain, she stepped into his arms and pressed her face against his chest, finally allowing herself to seek the comfort she needed. For a moment, Xavier stood frozen, and Delilah thought she had made a terrible mistake. Then his arms came around her, strong and sure, and he held her while she shook with reaction. One hand stroked her hair, and she heard him murmuring reassurances, promises that he would keep her safe, that those men would not touch her again. When she finally pulled back, embarrassed by her display, she found Xavier looking down at her with an expression that stole her breath. There was concern there, yes, and anger at the men who had threatened her. But there was something else, something heated and intense that made her very aware of how close they were standing, how his hand still rested on her waist, how his eyes had dropped to her lips. "Delilah," he said, her name rough in his throat. "I should not. We should not." "Why not?" she asked, emboldened by adrenaline and the sudden, fierce certainty that she wanted this, wanted him. "You are not my owner. I am a free woman, and you are a free man. Why should we not?" "Because I bought you," he said, anguish in his voice. "No matter what I intended, no matter that I freed you, that will always be between us. I do not want you to feel obligated or grateful, or she kissed him. It was not expert or practiced, but it was honest, a press of her lips against his that silenced his protests and communicated what words could not. For a heartbeat, he remained still, and she thought she had misread everything. Then he made a sound low in his throat and kissed her back, his mouth moving over hers with a tenderness that made her melt against him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "This is not gratitude talking. This is me talking," Delilah said firmly. "Me, Delilah Porter, who is free to make her own choices. And I choose you, Xavier Yates. I choose to stay here not because I owe you, but because I want to be nowhere else. Because somewhere between that auction block and today, I fell in love with you." She heard his breath catch, saw the wonder dawn in his eyes. "You love me, I love you." Saying it felt like freedom, like stepping off a cliff and finding she could fly. "Is that so hard to believe?" "Yes," he said honestly. "I am just a cowboy with a small ranch and too many rough edges. You could have anyone. I do not want anyone, I want you." She cupped his face, feeling the rasp of stubble against her palms. "Do you want me?" "More than my next breath," he said, and kissed her again, deeper this time with a passion that had been restrained for too long. "I have wanted you since I first saw you on that auction block, looking so scared and so brave. I have wanted you every day since, watching you bring life to this place, watching you bloom from that frightened girl into the strongest woman I have ever known. I love you, Delilah. God help me, I love you so much." Joy, pure and incandescent, flooded through her. She kissed him again and again until they were both laughing and breathless. Xavier picked her up and spun her around, and she felt the last chains of her captivity fall away. She was free. She was loved. She was home. That night, they sat on the porch and talked until the stars came out, making plans and promises. Xavier wanted to marry her properly, wanted to ride to the nearest town with a preacher and make her his wife in the eyes of God and the law. Delilah wanted that too, wanted the security of a marriage that no one could dispute, wanted to build a future with this man who had given her back her life. But more than that, she wanted him to know that she understood what he had sacrificed for her, the money he had spent, the supplies he had foregone. "I will help you rebuild," she said. "We will make this ranch prosper together. I can keep chickens for eggs to sell, grow vegetables to take to market. We will work side by side and build something wonderful." "We already have something wonderful," Xavier said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "But yes, we will build it even better, together." They were married 3 weeks later in a small settlement called Bannock, by a circuit preacher who asked no questions about their hasty courtship. Delilah wore a simple dress of blue calico that Xavier had bought her, and he wore his best shirt and a string tie that made him tug at his collar uncomfortably. They spoke their vows in a one-room church with only the preacher's wife and a curious miner as witnesses. And when Xavier kissed her as his wife, Delilah felt a happiness she had thought lost forever. The ride back to the ranch was leisurely, Xavier in no hurry to return, clearly wanting to extend this wedding day as long as possible. They stopped by the same creek where he had first told her she was free, and Delilah pulled him down to sit beside her in the grass. "I have been thinking about that day," she said, watching the water flow over smooth stones. "About how you burned that paper and told me I could go anywhere. Do you ever regret it? Regret freeing me instead of keeping me?" Xavier looked genuinely shocked. "Never, not for 1 second. Delilah, even if you had chosen to leave, even if you had gone to Virginia City or back to Fort Benton or anywhere else, I would not regret it. Your freedom was not conditional on you choosing me. But I did choose you," she said softly, "and I will choose you every day for the rest of my life." He pulled her close, kissing her temple. Then I am the luckiest man in Montana. They made it back to the ranch by nightfall, and Xavier carried her over the threshold of the cabin in the tradition of new marriages, both of them laughing at the formality of it. But the laughter faded as they stood in the main room, suddenly shy with each other despite their earlier declarations. "I know this is not what you imagined," Xavier said, gesturing at the simple cabin. "No grand hotel, no fancy wedding trip, just this rough place and a rougher man." Delilah turned to him, taking his hands in hers. "This is exactly what I imagined. You are exactly who I want. I do not need grand hotels or fancy trips. I need you and this home we are building together and the life we will make. That is everything." That night, in the small bedroom that had been hers alone, Xavier loved her with a gentleness and reverence that brought tears to her eyes. He was patient with her inexperience, careful with her body, and when she finally fell asleep in his arms, she felt wholly safe for the first time since her mother had died. The autumn that followed their marriage was golden in more ways than one. The ranch prospered under their joint efforts. The cattle fattened on the rich grass, and the garden yielded a bounty that Delilah preserved for the winter. They worked side by side during the days and fell into each other's arms at night, building a partnership that was as much about mutual respect as it was about love. Xavier taught Delilah to shoot, insisting she know how to protect herself and the ranch. She proved a quick study, her small hands steady on the rifle, her eye true. He also taught her the business side of ranching, sharing his plans to expand the herd, his dreams of making this place into something substantial. For her part, Delilah brought order and comfort to Xavier's rough bachelor existence. She made curtains for the windows, braided rugs for the floors, planted flowers that would bloom in the spring. She learned to make soap and candles, to churn butter and smoke meat. Every skill she mastered was another brick in the foundation of their life together. They had been married about 2 months when riders came again, but this time, Delilah was not afraid. Xavier was beside her on the porch, his rifle within easy reach, and the 3 men who approached wore badges that gleamed in the afternoon sun. The lead rider was a grizzled man in his 50s with a sheriff's star pinned to his vest. He tipped his hat to Delilah. "Madam, I am Sheriff Crawford from Fort Benton. This is Deputy Mills and Deputy Hartley. We are looking for Xavier Yates." "You found him," Xavier said, his voice neutral. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" "Well, it is more what we can do for you." Crawford dismounted, pulling a document from his saddlebag. "We have been investigating some claims made by a group of men about an improper debt settlement. Turns out Grimsby, the fellow who ran that auction, was operating outside the law. He has been arrested, along with the men he was working with. Your wife's father included, I am sorry to say." Delilah felt Xavier's hand find hers, squeezing gently. "I am not sorry," she said quietly. Crawford nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Can't say I blame you, madam. At any rate, we wanted to bring you this." He handed the document to Xavier. "It is a legal decree from the territorial judge, declaring that auction null and void, and affirming that Delilah Porter Yates is, and has always been a free woman with all rights and privileges thereof." Xavier scanned the document, then passed it to Delilah. She read through the legal language, feeling something tight in her chest finally loosen. It was official now, not just burned paper and faith, but the law of the land recognizing her freedom. "Thank you, Sheriff," Xavier said. "This means a great deal to us. Least we could do." Crawford remounted his horse. "Those men will not be troubling you again. Grimsby and his associates are looking at prison time, and your father-in-law, well, he took sick while in custody. Fever took him 3 days ago. I am sorry for your loss." Delilah felt Xavier tense beside her, waiting for her reaction. She searched herself for grief and found only a distant sadness for the man her father had been before drink and cards destroyed him. "Thank you for telling me, Sheriff." After the lawman left, Xavier drew Delilah into his arms, holding her as she processed this final severance from her old life. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Free," she said simply. "Truly, completely free. He cannot hurt me anymore. No one can." "No one," Xavier agreed fiercely. "I will make sure of that." Winter came hard that year, with snows that piled high against the cabin walls and winds that howled through the mountain passes. But inside, Delilah and Xavier were warm, their small home a haven against the cold. They spent the long, dark evenings reading to each other from the small collection of books Xavier owned, playing cards, talking about everything and nothing. It was during one of these winter nights, with snow falling soft outside the window, that Delilah told Xavier she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but wanted to be certain before saying anything. When she finally shared the news, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He whooped with joy, picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down and apologized for jostling her. "I am not made of glass," she laughed. "The baby will be fine." "Our baby," he said wonderingly, placing a hand on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby. We are." She covered his hand with hers. "Are you happy?" Happy does not begin to cover it. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You have given me so much, Delilah. A home, a purpose, love, and now a child. I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I thank God for you every single day." "You saved me," she said simply. "You gave me freedom and your heart. Everything else is just us building on that foundation." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter and into spring. Delilah bloomed with impending motherhood, her skin glowing, her happiness evident in every smile. Xavier was attentive to the point of being comical, constantly worried about her doing too much, trying to take over all the household chores until she finally had to put her foot down. "I am pregnant, not an invalid," she told him firmly. "I will let you know if I need help, but I am perfectly capable of cooking and cleaning." "I just want you to rest," he protested. "I rest plenty. What I need is to stay active and useful. Trust me, I know my own body." Their first child, a son, was born on a warm day in June, attended by a midwife from a neighboring ranch in Xavier, who refused to leave despite the midwife's protests that birthing rooms were no place for men. Delilah was grateful for his presence, his hand in hers, his voice encouraging her through the pain. When the baby finally emerged, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Xavier cut the cord with shaking hands and placed the tiny bundle on Delilah's chest. "He is beautiful," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You are amazing. I have never seen anything braver than what you just did." They named him Thomas, after Xavier's father who had died when Xavier was young. Thomas Yates was a healthy, hungry baby who quickly became the center of their world. Xavier was a devoted father, getting up for night feedings, walking the floor when Thomas was fussy, staring at his son with an expression of wonder that never seemed to fade. Delilah watched her husband with their child and felt her heart swell with love. This was what she had been saved for, she thought. Not just to survive, but to build this beautiful life, to know this deep and abiding happiness. The years that followed were full of hard work and joy. The ranch grew slowly but steadily, Xavier's careful management and Delilah's frugality allowing them to expand the herd, improve the cabin, build a better barn. They hired a hand to help with the heavy work. A quiet young man named James who lived in a small bunkhouse Xavier built, and who treated Delilah with shy respect. Thomas grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved following his father around the ranch, mimicking Xavier's walk and trying to wear his hat. When he was 3, Delilah became pregnant again, and their daughter Ruth was born in the spring of 1883. Ruth was a quieter child than her brother, with Delilah's wheat-colored hair and Xavier's storm-cloud eyes, and she had both her parents wrapped around her tiny finger from the moment she entered the world. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Xavier and Delilah worked together to make the ranch prosperous, raising their children with love and discipline, building a reputation in the territory as fair dealers and good neighbors. They weathered droughts and hard winters, celebrated good years and survived lean ones, always together, always united. Fort Benton became a distant memory, a bad dream from another life. Delilah rarely thought about the auction or her father or the girl she had been on that terrible day. When she did, it was with gratitude for how far she had come, for the life she had built from ashes. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Delilah with a trip to Helena, the territorial capital. They left the children with James and his new wife, who had moved to a neighboring property, and rode to the city like newlyweds. Xavier had saved for months to afford a stay in a real hotel, with indoor plumbing and a restaurant, and all the luxuries Delilah had never known. On their last night in Helena, after a fine dinner and a walk through the gaslit streets, they returned to their hotel room and Xavier pulled out a small velvet box. "I know I am 10 years late with this," he said, opening it to reveal a delicate gold ring with a small diamond. "But I wanted you to have a proper wedding ring, not just the plain band I could afford back then." Delilah looked at the ring, then at her current band, worn smooth by years of work and love. "I love my wedding ring. It represents everything we have built together." "I know." He took the new ring out, slipping it on her finger next to the old one. "But I wanted you to have this too, because you deserve beautiful things, Delilah. You deserve everything." She kissed him, tasting salt from the tears she did not realize were falling. "I already have everything. I have you and our children and our home. What more could I possibly want?" "More years," he said, pulling her close. "More days like this, more of everything with you." "Then we will have them," she promised. "A lifetime of them," and they did. They grew old together on that Montana ranch, watching their children grow and marry and have children of their own. Thomas took over the ranch when Xavier's back started to give him trouble, proving to have his father's skill with cattle and his mother's head for business. Ruth married a schoolteacher and moved to Billings but visited often, bringing her own children to run wild on the land their grandfather had tamed. Delilah and Xavier built a larger house when the cabin grew too small, but they kept the original cabin standing, a monument to where their life together had truly begun. On warm evenings, they would sit on the porch of the new house, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink, holding hands like the young couple they had once been. "You ever regret it?" Delilah asked one such evening, when they were both in their 60s and the ranch spread out before them in prosperous testimony to their years of work. "Spending that money to free me. You could have used it to build all this faster, to have an easier life." Xavier looked at her with the same intensity he had shown that day by the creek, when he had burned the paper that claimed ownership of her. His hair was silver now, his face lined by sun and wind and time, but his eyes were still that clear winter gray, still full of love. "Not for 1 second," he said firmly. "That money bought me the only thing worth having. It bought me you. Everything else, this ranch, this life, it all came from that choice, and I would make it again in a heartbeat." She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady strength of him, the warmth that had been her shelter for so many years. "I love you, Xavier Yates, from that first day to this one and every day beyond. And I love you, Delilah Yates, my salvation, my heart." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire. Around them, the ranch settled into evening routines, the sounds of cattle lowing and horses nickering, the smoke from the bunkhouse chimney rising straight in the still air. This was home. This was love. This was the life they had built from a moment of compassion and courage, grown into something strong and beautiful and enduring. In the years that followed, they remained active in the ranch work as much as their aging bodies allowed, Xavier still riding out to check fence lines, Delilah still tending her ever-expanding garden. They became pillars of their small community, known for their generosity and wisdom, their door always open to neighbors in need. When Montana achieved statehood in 1889, they traveled to Helena for the celebration, bringing their children and grandchildren to witness history. Standing in the crowd as the speeches rang out, Delilah reflected on how much had changed since that terrible day in Fort Benton. She had gone from property to be sold to a free woman, from a victim to a victor, from alone to surrounded by family who loved her. And it had all started with a cowboy who saw a woman in trouble and decided to help, not because he expected anything in return, but because it was right. Xavier had given her freedom and his heart, and she had given him the same in return. Everything else had flowed from that simple exchange of gifts. Thomas eventually had 5 children of his own, keeping the ranch busy and loud with young voices. Ruth gave them 3 grandchildren who visited every summer, filling the house with laughter. Delilah taught the girls to cook and sew and garden, while Xavier taught the boys to ride and rope and respect the land. They passed on not just skills but values, the importance of hard work and kindness, of standing up for what was right even when it cost you something. On their 30th anniversary, the whole family gathered for a celebration. The house was full to bursting with children and grandchildren, and tables laden with food stretched across the yard. As Delilah looked at the faces around her, all these people who existed because Xavier had chosen compassion over indifference, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Xavier must have seen something in her expression because he pulled her aside, away from the crowd, to the old cabin they had preserved. They stood in the small bedroom where they had begun their married life, where their children had been conceived, where so many tender moments had unfolded. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "That we have been blessed beyond measure," she said. "That from the worst day of my life came the best, that I would not change a single moment of our journey together, even the hard parts, because they brought us here. To this place. To this life. With you." She turned in his arms, cupping his weathered face in her hands. "You are still my hero, Xavier. After all these years, after everything we have been through, you are still the man who rode up to that auction block and changed my world." He kissed her, soft and sweet, a kiss that held 3 decades of love and trust and partnership. "And you are still my miracle. The woman who turned a house into a home, who gave me a family, who taught me that love can heal even the deepest wounds." They stood there for a long moment, holding each other in the small room where their love had first been consummated, surrounded by the echoes of all the years they had shared. Outside, they could hear their family laughing and calling to each other, the sound of the future they had created together. Eventually, they returned to the celebration, but Delilah carried that moment with her, a reminder of the foundation on which their life was built. Not on the transaction that had tried to reduce her to property, but on the freedom and love that had elevated her to partnership. As they grew older, Delilah and Xavier began to slow down, letting Thomas take more of the ranch responsibilities, spending more time on the porch watching the world go by. They talked about everything and nothing, shared memories of their years together, planned for the legacy they would leave behind. "I want the ranch to stay in the family," Xavier said one evening. "Thomas understands the land, respects it. He will take care of it." "He will," Delilah agreed. "We have taught him well. Both our children know the value of hard work and treating others fairly. We did good, did not we?" There was a note of wonder in his voice. Two broken people who found each other and managed to build something whole. "We did better than good," Delilah said firmly. "We did extraordinary." Xavier passed away in his sleep in the spring of 1900, with Delilah beside him, his hand in hers. He was 70 years old and had lived to see the turn of the century, had watched Montana grow from a wild territory to a prosperous state, had built a legacy that would endure for generations. His last words to Delilah were, "I love you," and she held those words close as she grieved. But she did not grieve alone. Her children and grandchildren surrounded her with love, held her up when the pain of loss threatened to drag her under. They reminded her that Xavier lived on in all of them, in the values he had instilled, in the ranch he had built, in the love he had shown. Delilah lived another 8 years, spending her final time on earth surrounded by family, tending her garden, telling stories of the Wild West days to grandchildren and great-grandchildren who could scarcely imagine such times. She spoke often of Xavier, keeping his memory alive, making sure the younger generations knew the kind of man he had been. On quiet evenings, she would walk to the old cabin and sit in the small bedroom, remembering the girl she had been and the woman she had become. She would think about that day by the creek when Xavier had burned the paper and told her she was free, how that single act of compassion had changed the trajectory of her entire life. She never forgot the terror of the auction block, but she did not let it define her. Instead, she chose to be defined by what came after, by the choices she made as a free woman, by the love she built with a cowboy who saw her humanity when others saw only property. When Delilah passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1908, surrounded by family, she was laid to rest beside Xavier on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. The headstones were simple but spoke volumes. Xavier Yates, it read. Beloved husband, father, grandfather. He gave freely and loved deeply. Delilah Porter Yates. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She chose freedom and found love. The ranch continued under Thomas's stewardship and eventually passed to his eldest son. The family grew and spread, but they never forgot the story of how it all began, with a cowboy who spent his fortune to free a woman from bondage, and a woman who chose to stay not out of obligation but out of love. Their story became legend in that part of Montana, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But those who knew the truth, who had heard it from Delilah's own lips, knew it was all real. Every moment of terror and triumph, every sacrifice and reward, every heartbreak and joy. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth that transcended the specific circumstances of their meeting. Love, real love, was about choice and freedom, about seeing the humanity in another person and honoring it, about building something together that was stronger than what either could create alone. Xavier had given Delilah freedom when she had none, had loved her when she felt unlovable, had built a life with her when she thought her future was forfeit. And Delilah had given him purpose and partnership, had shown him that his past did not define his future, had created a home filled with love and laughter where before there had been only loneliness and rough living. They had saved each other in the end. Not just once, on that day in Fort Benton, but every day of their lives together, in small ways and large, in moments of crisis and moments of quiet contentment. They had chosen each other again and again, and that choice had made all the difference. The old cabin stood for many years after both were gone, a testament to where it had all begun. Eventually, time and weather took their toll, and it collapsed into itself, returning to the earth from which Xavier had hewn the logs. But the house they had built to replace it still stood, occupied by their descendants, filled with the echoes of their love. And on summer evenings, when the sun painted the Montana mountains gold and the wind whispered through the grass they had once walked together, it was easy to imagine them there still. Xavier and Delilah, Cowboy and the woman he freed, standing together on the porch of their home, hands clasped, looking out over the legacy of their love with satisfaction and joy. Their story was not just about the dramatic rescue, though that was how it began. It was about what came after, about the daily choice to love and honor and build together. It was about overcoming trauma and betrayal to find trust and partnership. It was about two people who had every reason to be broken choosing instead to be whole. And it was about the simple, profound truth that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead us to the best. That sometimes being saved is not just about being rescued, but about being seen, about being valued, about being given the freedom to choose who we want to be. Delilah had been sold to pay her father's debts, reduced to property, stripped of agency and dignity. Xavier had given her freedom, but more than that, he had given her his heart, his respect, his partnership. And she had given him the same in return, freely and fully, creating a love that lasted a lifetime and a legacy that endured for generations. In the end, that was the story worth telling. Not just how it began in fear and desperation, but how it grew into something beautiful and enduring. A cowboy and the woman he freed, choosing each other every day, building a life and a love that proved stronger than any obstacle, sweeter than any hardship, more enduring than time itself. Their graves on the hill overlooking the ranch became a place of pilgrimage for their descendants, a reminder of where they came from and the values they should carry forward. And every year on the anniversary of Xavier's bold bid at that terrible auction, the family would gather to tell the story once more, keeping alive the memory of a love that began with freedom and grew into forever.